Welcome. This is our Afterthoughts segment where we keep our guests around from Mainebiz Sunday, from our broadcast program. We keep them around for a little extra talk that we show only on the web. We're fortunate this week to have former Governor Angus King here with us today. We're talking about business issues. We're talking about the governor's race. And we're also going to be talking a little about the wind initiative projects that he's been involved with. Governor, thanks for sticking around.
Absolutely.
We appreciate that.
Sure.
So I want to follow up on some of the questions we had on the show. We were talking about kind of the whole kind of group of folks running for governor and what makes a good governor and what they should expect to when they take that chair as the CEO. So I guess one of the things I want to know is how important, what effect does the legislature have? I mean, once they're in place, does everything just go out the window and then you have to figure out how to redo this whole economic development strategy with the legislature?
First, let me, I had a thought when you asked the question before.
Sure.
And this is an afterthought.
Absolutely.
You said, what's the first thing the governor's going to have to deal with? And you know what the answer is? Nobody knows.
Yeah.
It will be something entirely surprising.
Okay.
It will be something that you didn't think about. It will be
What surprised you?
Oh, you know, any number of things. The ice storm.
Yeah,
I mean, I remember walking through the Maine Emergency Management and saying, why do we have this? Why are we doing all this? You know, why are we spending this money? Well, a couple of years later, the ice storm, and we needed it. So that's the kind of thing that you really can't prepare for. A vivid memory I have is early in my term, the fellow up in Waterville who murdered a couple of nuns. Tragic, awful case. He had been peripherally related to state care, and you know, so those are the kinds of things that, you know, when you're running, you have no idea that you're going to face those things. But one of the interesting things about being governor, the reason I thought I loved the job, was the variety of what you deal with. And one morning you're talking about education, a few hours later you're talking about salmon, a couple hours later after that you're talking about energy policy. It's very varied and somewhat unpredictable. But let me answer your question. I came into office with a very clear perception, belief that whatever we did had to go through the legislature. I mean, you've used the term CEO. If the governor is the CEO, the legislature is the board of directors. And they are the ones ultimately who have to pass the laws. They have to. The governor can have a great idea for some new tax break to attract business. It's got to be passed by the legislatures.
I wanted to ask you about business attraction, because that's also a subject that comes up a lot with our candidates. Matt Jacobson says that when you're in a regulatory regime that's as uncertain, that's a difficult way to attract investment and businesses to the state. What kind of tools in the governor's toolbox do you have to actually attract businesses to the state of Maine?
For a while, Maine basically did nothing about business attraction. We did internal. We had DECD, the Economic and Community Development, that focused pretty much on internal development, which, by the way, is where the primary focus should be. The idea that you're going to attract a lot of businesses from other parts of the country, yes, you should do that, but the real growth takes place organically internally. It's businesses in Maine that go from 50 employees to 55 or 3 to 4. That's where the bulk of the creation of jobs takes place in any growing economy.
So what are the growth areas? I don't know. It could be wind energy or anything. I don't know.
Well, we'll talk about that.
Yeah. Seriously, what are the next? What's the next thing for Maine in terms of job growth?
Well, you could easily turn that question and say, "What's the next thing for America?" And I wish I knew. I think it's very hard. I think it's very hard to read right now, perhaps as hard as it's ever been in our history, to say what comes next. I think clearly what comes next are jobs that involve education and technology. Whether that's financial services, back office, some kind of innovation, software. I mean, the great opportunity for Maine is that we're moving into a world where geography doesn't determine destiny.
And do we have the infrastructure, you think, in place?
We do. I mean, we have...
Broadband?
Verizon did a very good job of getting a lot of infrastructure into place before they sold to Fairpoint. I hope Fairpoint can maintain that investment. That's crucial. We've got pretty decent transportation infrastructure in terms of the highways, airports. We could use more work, you know, I think a little more development of rail and those kinds of things. So all those are important, but we're in pretty good shape. Rural areas are not in good shape in terms of broadband, and I know the governor's had an initiative on that, and I applaud him for it. That's the right way to move. Technology, I think, is going to help in that area as we move along, satellite and those kinds of things. But it's exactly, I mean, President Lincoln, when he ran for Congress in Illinois in the 1840s, was all about infrastructure. Except instead of talking about broadband, he was talking about roads and canals.
Right.
That's the heart of what you need to build your economy. And so we've got to keep investing in those kinds of infrastructure projects, highways, roads, and I think we got to keep working on figuring out how to get broadband in.
Yeah, I think so too. I do want to one final thing I want to get your take on and what you're doing right now with wind energy. Give us the kind of 30-second elevator pitch on what you're doing with wind energy and what you think that's going to mean for Maine.
Well, it's a major opportunity for Maine. Maine has more wind resources than anybody else in New England. It's something we have, and I think it makes sense to try to responsibly develop it. Responsibly, I mean, it doesn't mean you put turbines everywhere.
Right.
The problem with turbines are they're visible.
Big.
I read a comment in the newspaper criticizing Jonathan Carter, saying, you know, he wants to put turbines underground. You can't do that. They got to be up on top of mountains or out in the ocean.
Right.
And I'm a big advocate of working out in the ocean, but that's 10 or 12 years away. The technology doesn't exist for deep water wind. It's a very promising technology. It's going to have a big impact, I think, on the future of Maine. But in the short term, we need to start doing things to get us off of fossil fuels, and domestic onshore wind is one way to do it. We have a tendency in Maine to sort of strangle what we have. I'm a great believer that you've got to use your assets. For example, the barriers that have been put up for Poland Spring. Here's a clean business creating jobs using an asset that Maine has, which is water. There's plenty of it. And yet, you know, they're getting opposition and people are trying to stop them and all that kind of thing. And I see a similar thing with wind. And when I was governor, I saw a similar thing with aquaculture, where here's a tremendously promising thing that Maine has that Iowa and Colorado don't. And yet, you know, we put the squeeze on it, particularly the feds, regulatorily, and it choked it off.
That kind of gets back to our governor's question, I think, is what would a CEO, what should the governor do to kind of change that message, to change it? Is it possible even? With the wind energy piece, clearly everything that's happening, there's going to be regulatory issues, but there's also going to be environmental issues that are really going to slow it up and in many cases strangle it.
Well, I think a governor has to, as this governor has, I mean, he's embraced wind energy. It certainly, it's not a big job creator. Nobody argues that it is, but it creates some jobs. Tremendous investment in Maine. I mean, there's probably been already $500 million invested in Maine in terms of wind energy. A lot of that has gone into Maine businesses, creating Maine jobs. And then the whole thing of ultimately stabilizing energy prices, not necessarily lowering them. These things are expensive. But in the long run, do you want something that has a fixed value to its energy once you build it? The wind is free, just like hydro. Or do you want to be at the mercy of the oil cartel and the natural gas pipeline? So, you know, that's a kind of trade-off. I see big benefits. I got into this because I thought it would be good for Maine, and now we're encountering a lot of opposition, which I think, frankly, is ill-informed.
And it seems like it's going to be that balance all along of the economic benefits and then the environmental issues, but then making that story and keeping that story consistent and showing those benefits over the long term, I think that's going to make the difference.
Absolutely. But again, I think the basic point is, if you're CEO of any enterprise, the first thing you want to do is take stock of your assets. And then you say, how do we what's our comparative advantage? What do we have that other places don't have? And a couple of things we have is a lot of water, we have the Gulf of Maine, and we have wind energy. And it just seems to me logical that you take advantage. If you systematically say no to the things that you happen to have, then you're left with a kind of your sort of you know, big national park, and I don't think that's an adequate future for Maine.
Right. Good. Well said. Thank you. Appreciate it. We're going to leave it there.
Thanks,
Thanks a lot.
Great to see you again.
Thank you all.